The hidden truth behind the brass ankles cabins, the forbidden tribe of the Appalachian Mountains. I have spent my career writing about violence, documenting the ways that human beings destroy each other for money, for power, for reasons that often make no sense to anyone outside the moment when the trigger is pulled or the blade descends. I have interviewed serial killers and their surviving victims, investigated cold cases that law enforcement had abandoned decades ago, and walked through crime scenes where the blood had long since been scrubbed away, but the memory of what happened remained in the walls themselves. I thought I understood the geography of American murder, the networks through which violence flows, the communities that produce killers, and the communities that harbor them. I was wrong. What I discovered in the swamps and forests along the South Carolina-North Carolina border in 2021 was something I had never imagined. A community that had transformed its rejection by mainstream society into a weapon, a network that had been providing murder and disposal services for more than a century, while remaining completely invisible to the law enforcement agencies that should have detected it long ago. I am writing this now because my book was never published, because my evidence was destroyed, and because somewhere in those swamps right now the people who held me captive are still operating, still accepting contracts, still making bodies disappear into the dark water that has swallowed so many secrets over the generations. My name is Jacqueline Monroe. I was a true crime writer based in Atlanta, author of 3 books that had achieved modest commercial success and critical recognition within the genre. My specialty was historical crimes, cases from decades or even centuries past that had never been solved, but that contained enough documentary evidence to allow reconstruction of what had happened. I was drawn to these cases because they offered perspective that contemporary crimes could not provide. The long view that revealed patterns and connections invisible in the immediate aftermath of violence. When I decided to write about the mixed-race isolate communities of the American South, I saw an opportunity to combine historical research with contemporary investigation, to tell stories that had been overlooked by mainstream true crime writers who focused on cases with cleaner racial narratives. I did not understand that some stories remain untold because the people at their center have made sure of it. The brass ankles were one of several mixed-race isolate communities that had existed in the American South since the colonial era. Like the Melungeons of Appalachia, the Lumbee of North Carolina, and the Redbones of Louisiana, they were people whose ancestry combined European, African, and Native American heritage in proportions that defied the rigid racial categories that white America had constructed to organize its society. The name itself was a slur, derived from the supposed yellow-brown color of their skin, applied by white neighbors who needed some term to describe people who did not fit into the binary of white and black that defined the Jim Crow South. The brass ankles had lived in the swamps and forests along the South Carolina-North Carolina border for as long as anyone could remember, maintaining their own communities, marrying among themselves, and remaining largely invisible to the larger society that had rejected them. I became interested in the brass ankles through genealogical research I was conducting for another project. I had been tracing the family histories of victims of racial violence in the early 20th century South, documenting the lynchings and murders that had terrorized black communities during the Jim Crow era. In the course of this research, I encountered references to people whose racial status was unclear, victims and perpetrators whose names appeared in records, but whose racial designation shifted between documents or was left blank entirely. Some of these individuals, I discovered, were connected to the brass ankles community, people whose ambiguous status had allowed them to move between racial categories in ways that pure-blood individuals could not. This mobility fascinated me, and I began to wonder what stories might be hidden in the history of people who had existed outside the categories that organized Southern society. My initial research suggested a community that had suffered greatly from its outsider status. The brass ankles had been denied the privileges of whiteness, while also being rejected by black communities that saw them as trying to escape their African heritage. They had been pushed into the least desirable land, the swamps and bottomlands that white farmers did not want. and they had survived through subsistence agriculture, hunting, and whatever wage labor they could find in a society that did not fully accept them. The historical record was sparse, reflecting the general indifference of mainstream society to people who did not fit its categories. But what existed suggested a story of marginalization and endurance that I believed would resonate with contemporary readers interested in the complexities of American racial history. I traveled to the region in the spring of 2021 as vaccination programs were beginning to lift the restrictions that had limited travel during the pandemic. The area where the brass ankles had historically lived was still sparsely populated, a landscape of swamps, forests, and small farms that had changed remarkably little over the past century. The communities I visited were poor, isolated, and suspicious of outsiders in ways that reminded me of other marginalized populations I had encountered during my research. People were willing to talk about the past in general terms, sharing stories about the old days and the hardships their ancestors had endured. But they became evasive when I asked about specific individuals or events that I had identified through archival research. There was something they were protecting, I sensed, some secret that the community had agreed to keep from outsiders, regardless of how sympathetic those outsiders might appear. The breakthrough came through a contact I developed at a local historical society, an elderly man named Walter Creech, who had spent decades documenting the history of the region's mixed-race communities. Walter was not brass ankles himself, but had grown up near their settlements and had known many community members during his long life. He was initially reluctant to speak with me, citing concerns about how his information might be used, but I eventually convinced him that my intentions were scholarly rather than sensational. What he told me during our conversations over several weeks changed my understanding of the brass ankles completely and set me on the path that would nearly cost me my life. The brass ankles had survived, Walter told me, by finding economic niches that their ambiguous status uniquely suited them to fill. In the early decades of their existence, this had meant serving as intermediaries between white and Native American communities, trading goods and information across boundaries that others could not easily cross. Later, during the antebellum period, some brass ankles had worked as slave catchers, using their ability to pass in multiple contexts to track enslaved people who had fled to freedom. This was shameful history, Walter acknowledged, but it was history that needed to be understood if I wanted to comprehend how the community had developed. They had learned early that their outsider status could be an asset rather than just a liability. That invisibility had value in a society where being seen often meant being victimized. After the Civil War, Walter continued, the brass ankles had found new ways to monetize their invisibility. The Jim Crow era had created opportunities for people who could move between racial worlds without attracting attention, people who could go places and do things that pure-blood individuals could not. Some brass ankles had worked as informants, selling information about black communities to white authorities or vice versa. Others had worked as smugglers, moving contraband through a landscape they knew better than any outsider could. And some, Walter said, lowering his voice as though the walls might be listening, had found an even darker niche. They had become specialists in making people disappear. Walter's account of this final evolution was fragmentary and hedged with qualifications, the testimony of a man who knew more than he was willing to say directly. He spoke of contracts that had passed through the community for generations, arrangements by which wealthy and powerful people could dispose of problems that could not be solved through legal means. He spoke of bodies buried in swamps that would never be drained, weighted down with chains and stones in water, so dark that nothing could be seen below the surface. He spoke of a network that connected the brass ankles to organized crime throughout the Southeast, providing services that no other community could provide, because no other community combined invisibility with the absolute loyalty that shared secrets created. He spoke of all this, and then he stopped, refusing to say anything more, warning me that continuing to investigate would be dangerous in ways I could not imagine. I should have heeded his warning. I should have recognized that some stories are protected by forces that no journalist or writer can overcome. But I was too intrigued by what I had learned, too convinced that I was on the verge of a discovery that would transform my career, too arrogant to believe that the danger Walter described could apply to someone like me. I continued my research with increased intensity, digging through archives and courthouse records for evidence that would confirm or refute what Walter had suggested. What I found was disturbing enough to convince me that his account had been true. The records showed patterns that I had never noticed before, disappearances and deaths that clustered in ways that suggested something more than random violence. I found references to people who had vanished from communities throughout the Southeast, their disappearances coinciding with disputes over money, property, or reputation. I found court cases that had collapsed when key witnesses disappeared before they could testify. I found estates that had been settled in favor of beneficiaries who had been vocal in their conflicts with the deceased. I found, in short, evidence of a pattern that stretched back more than a century, a pattern in which people who had become problems for someone with money had simply ceased to exist. The geography of these disappearances was concentrated in the region where the brass ankles lived, suggesting that the community had been providing its services primarily to clients in the surrounding area. But I also found cases that extended further, disappearances in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and even Florida, that followed the same pattern, and that seemed to be connected through intermediaries I could not identify. The network, if it existed, was larger than Walter had suggested, a regional operation that had been serving clients for generations while remaining completely invisible to the law enforcement agencies that should have detected it. I made the mistake of contacting one of the intermediaries I had identified through my research, a man in Colombia whose name appeared in connection with several suspicious transactions I had uncovered. I presented myself as a writer researching the history of the region, asked innocent-seeming questions about family connections and property transactions, and watched his face shift from hospitality to suspicion to something that might have been fear. He ended our conversation abruptly, claimed he had no knowledge of the matters I was asking about, and showed me to the door with a haste that suggested I had touched something I should not have touched. Within a week, people began following me. Within 2 weeks, my motel room had been searched while I was away. Within 3 weeks, they came for me directly. They took me at night, 3 men who forced their way into my room and subdued me before I could scream or reach my phone. They bound me, hooded me, and transported me in a vehicle that drove for hours before arriving at a destination I could not see. When the hood was removed, I was in a cabin deep in the swamps, surrounded by people whose features confirmed the mixed heritage I had been researching, people who regarded me with the calm assessment of professionals evaluating a problem that needed to be solved. I understood immediately that I had found what I was looking for, and that finding it would almost certainly cost me my life. The man who interrogated me introduced himself only as Samuel, a name I suspected was not his real one. He was perhaps 60 years old, with skin the color of old copper and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He asked me questions about my research, about who I had spoken with, about what evidence I had gathered and where I had stored it. He was patient and methodical, repeating questions in different forms to check for consistency, probing for details that might indicate I had shared my discoveries with others who would continue the investigation if I disappeared. I told him the truth because I had no reason to lie and because I suspected he would know if I tried. I told him everything I knew, everything I had found, everyone I had spoken with. I told him because I hoped that cooperation might save my life, and because I understood that my only chance of survival was to convince him that I could be managed without being killed. The interrogation lasted for 3 days, conducted in sessions that were separated by long hours of waiting, in a small room with a locked door and a window that looked out on nothing but trees and water. During the waiting periods, I was fed adequately, treated without gratuitous cruelty, and given to understand that my fate would be determined by the community's assessment of the threat I posed. Samuel explained this to me during one of our sessions, speaking about the network with a candor that suggested he believed I would never have the opportunity to share what I learned. He wanted me to understand what I had stumbled into, he said, because understanding might help me make the right choices about how to proceed. The brass ankles had been providing disposal services since the 1880s, Samuel told me, when the first generation born after the Civil War had recognized the economic potential of their unique position. They had begun modestly, disposing of bodies for local criminals who needed problems to disappear. But the business had grown as word spread through the networks that connected the underworld of the New South. By the early 20th century, the community had established relationships with organized crime figures throughout the region, providing services that ranged from simple disposal to complete disappearance of living individuals who had become inconvenient to someone with money. The business had evolved over the decades, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the core competency that made the community valuable. During Prohibition, they had disposed of bodies for bootleggers and moonshiners, whose business conflicts turned lethal. During the Civil Rights era, they had worked for both sides, disposing of activists who had become too effective and informants who had been discovered by the movement. During the drug wars of the 1980s and 1990s, they had become essential partners for traffickers who needed bodies to disappear without attracting law enforcement attention. The network had survived every social change and every law enforcement innovation because it was invisible, because the people who comprised it did not exist in any meaningful sense for the broader society that surrounded them. The murder-for-hire aspect of the business had developed more gradually, Samuel explained, growing out of disposal services when clients began asking whether the community could also handle the initial problem rather than just the aftermath. The first contracts had been tentative, limited to targets who were already involved in criminal activity and whose disappearances would not attract significant attention. But success had bred expansion, and by the mid-20th century, the community was accepting contracts on a wide range of targets, from unfaithful spouses to business rivals, to witnesses in pending legal cases. The fees had risen accordingly, reaching levels that made the business the primary economic engine of the community, funding improvements to the swamp settlements and providing comfortable lives for families who had once survived on subsistence farming and day labor. Samuel described the operational methods with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting them. The community's members could move through Southern society without being remembered because they fit no category that observers expected to see. They were not white enough to attract the attention that attached to white strangers in black neighborhoods, not black enough to attract the attention that attached to black strangers in white neighborhoods. They were simply people of unclear origin who passed through and departed without leaving impressions in the memories of those who saw them. This invisibility was their greatest asset, cultivated through generations of experience and passed down through training that began in childhood. The disposal methods were equally refined. The swamps that surrounded the community's settlements were ideally suited for the permanent concealment of human remains. Bodies weighted with chains and stones would sink into water so murky that visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. The anaerobic conditions of the swamp bottom prevented the decomposition processes that would normally produce gases causing bodies to rise. The wildlife of the swamps, from alligators to snapping turtles to the countless smaller creatures that consume dead flesh, would reduce remains to scattered bones within weeks. And even if bones were eventually discovered, the swamps were so extensive and so difficult to search that connecting any remains to any particular missing person would be virtually impossible. I asked Samuel how many people the community had killed and disposed of over the generations. He considered the question for a long moment before answering that he did not know the exact number, that records had not been kept in the early decades, and that the totals had grown too large to track precisely in more recent times. He estimated that the number exceeded 1,000, possibly by a significant margin, counting both direct killings and disposals of bodies that had been killed by others. This represented more than a century of operations, he noted, an average that worked out to perhaps 10 or 15 per year, though the actual pace varied depending on economic conditions and the availability of clients willing to pay for the services offered. I spent 5 weeks in captivity, held in various locations within the community's territory, while the leadership debated what to do with me. I was not physically harmed during this period, but I was kept in conditions that made clear how easily I could be made to disappear. I was shown the swamps where bodies were disposed, taken on boat trips through channels where the water was so dark that the bow of the boat disappeared before it was fully submerged. I was introduced to community members who had participated in operations, people who spoke about killing with the casual professionalism of craftsmen discussing their trade. I was educated about the network in exhaustive detail, not because my captors expected me to survive, but because they wanted me to understand the futility of resistance if I was eventually released. The decision to release me came in late August, after weeks of deliberation that I was not permitted to observe. Samuel informed me that the community had decided I could be managed without being killed, primarily because my investigation had not progressed far enough to pose an immediate threat, and because killing a writer with established connections might attract more attention than allowing her to live with the knowledge that exposure would mean death. I would be released on conditions that he outlined with the clarity of a lawyer presenting a contract. I would not publish anything about the community. I would not contact law enforcement. I would not continue my research, and I would leave the region permanently. If I violated any of these conditions, he said, I would be found and I would disappear, and no one would ever know what had happened to me. I agreed to the conditions because I had no choice, and I was transported out of the swamps while blindfolded, released on a rural highway in the middle of the night, with my car keys and my wallet, but nothing else. All of my research materials had been confiscated and presumably destroyed. My laptop, my phone, my notebooks, my copies of archival documents, everything I had assembled over months of work was gone. I drove back to Atlanta in a daze, unsure whether I had actually survived or whether I was living some extended dream from which I would eventually wake to find myself still in the swamps, still waiting for the decision that would determine whether I lived or died. The weeks that followed were a slow realization that I could not simply resume my life as though nothing had happened. I could not write the book I had been researching, obviously, but I also could not explain to my publisher why the project had been abandoned, could not tell friends and colleagues why I had disappeared for weeks without communication, could not process what I had experienced without violating the conditions of my release. I developed symptoms that a therapist would later diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance and nightmares, and a constant sense that I was being watched by people who would act instantly if I gave them any reason. I stopped writing entirely, unable to concentrate on projects that seemed trivial compared to what I had witnessed, unable to trust that any investigation I conducted might not lead me back into similar danger. I tried once to report what I had experienced to law enforcement. The FBI agent who interviewed me listened politely, took notes, and promised to look into my claims. Weeks later, I received a form letter informing me that the investigation had been closed due to insufficient evidence. I do not know whether this outcome reflected genuine inability to corroborate my account, deliberate suppression by someone connected to the network, or simply the bureaucratic inertia that causes so many investigations to die without resolution. What I know is that the brass ankles are still operating, still accepting contracts, still disposing of bodies in swamps that have swallowed more than a century of secrets. I'm writing this account now because I have decided that the conditions of my release were never truly binding, that promises extracted under threat of death have no moral force, and that the truth must be documented even if it cannot be prosecuted. I am writing this knowing that publication may trigger the consequences that Samuel promised, that I may disappear just as so many others have disappeared over the generations. But I am tired of silence, tired of living with the knowledge of what I witnessed while doing nothing to expose it, tired of pretending that the people who held me captive have any legitimate claim to my obedience. The brass ankles are real, the murder-for-hire network is real, the swamps are full of bodies that will never be found, the remains of 1,000 or more victims whose families never learned what happened to them. The community that appears in historical records as a marginalized mixed-race population, pitiable victims of American racism, is actually something far more dangerous, a criminal enterprise that has weaponized its invisibility into a profitable business that has been operating for more than a century. If you are reading this and you have the ability to investigate, here is what I ask of you. Do not approach the community directly. They have been detecting and neutralizing threats for generations, and they will respond to any direct approach with the efficiency they have demonstrated so many times before. Instead, look for the clients. The network has served wealthy and powerful people throughout the Southeast for more than a century. Some of those clients are still alive. Some of their descendants know what their parents and grandparents did. Find those people. Build cases that connect the clients to the disappearances. Work backward from the contracts to the community that fulfilled them. Look for the bodies. The swamps are vast and difficult to search, but modern technology has made such searches more feasible than they were in past decades. Ground-penetrating radar, sonar, and other remote sensing technologies might detect the concentrations of remains that must exist in the areas where the community has been disposing of bodies for generations. A systematic search of the waterways I was shown might recover evidence that could be connected to specific missing persons through DNA analysis. The bodies are there, waiting to be found by someone with the resources and the determination to look for them. Most importantly, do not give up. The network has survived for more than a century because every previous attempt to expose it has failed. The failures are part of the network's mythology, proof that they are untouchable, evidence that cooperation is the only rational response to their power. This mythology is not invincible. It can be defeated by someone who refuses to be intimidated, who persists despite setbacks, who understands that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprise contains vulnerabilities that can be exploited. I was not able to be that person. I tried and I failed, and I have spent years living with the consequences of that failure. But maybe you can succeed where I failed. Maybe this account will reach someone who has the resources and the courage to finish what I started. My name is Jacqueline Monroe. I spent 5 weeks as a captive of the Brass Ankles murder network. I discovered an operation that has been killing people and disposing of bodies for more than a century. I escaped, but I could not bring the network down. The rest is up to you. The Forbidden Tribe is still accepting contracts. The swamps are still swallowing bodies. The invisible killers are still walking through Southern society without being seen or remembered. Please do not let them continue forever. Please do something, please. Before I conclude this account, I want to share additional details that might help an investigator succeed where I failed. During my captivity, I learned specific information about the network's operations that I have not previously disclosed because I feared retaliation. But I have decided that the potential benefit of full disclosure outweighs the personal risk, and that whoever pursues this truth will need every advantage I can provide. The network's client base has evolved over the generations, but has always centered on people with money and problems that could not be solved through legal means. In the early decades, the primary clients were wealthy landowners dealing with disputes over property and inheritance, people who had the resources to pay for permanent solutions and the social standing to avoid suspicion when their rivals disappeared. During the mid-20th century, the client base expanded to include organized crime figures who needed disposal services for the casualties of their business conflicts. More recently, the network has served a diverse clientele that includes business executives, professionals, and even occasional government officials who have found themselves in situations where someone needed to disappear permanently. The fee structure is tiered based on the complexity of the contract. Simple disposal of a body that has already been killed by someone else is the least expensive service, typically costing between $10,000 and $20,000, depending on the logistics involved. Murder of a target with minimal security or public profile costs between $50,000 and $100,000. Murder of a target with significant security or high public profile, requiring extensive planning and increased risk of detection, can cost several $100,000. The highest fees I heard mentioned during my captivity involved contracts in the millions, though I was not given details about what circumstances would justify such extreme prices. Payment is handled through intermediaries who operate in cities throughout the Southeast. These intermediaries are not brass ankles themselves, but rather individuals who have developed trusted relationships with the community over years of cooperation. They receive a commission on the contracts they arrange and provide the buffer between clients and operators that protects both parties from direct exposure. The intermediaries are drawn from various professional backgrounds, including lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, and others whose legitimate businesses provide cover for the transactions involved. I identified several intermediaries during my research before my capture, and I believe their names and locations could provide starting points for an investigation. The operational teams that carry out contracts typically consist of 3 to 5 individuals who have trained together from childhood. They are selected based on their ability to blend into different environments, their emotional stability under pressure, and their absolute loyalty to the community. The training begins in adolescence and continues for years before individuals are permitted to participate in actual operations. The teams are rotated between different types of contracts to prevent any single group from developing patterns that might be detected by investigators. After each operation, the participants return to normal life within the community, indistinguishable from neighbors who have never taken part in the network's business. The community maintains extensive records of its operations, stored in locations that were not revealed to me, but that were referenced during my interrogations. These records include information about clients, targets, payments, and disposal locations, maintained for purposes that were not explained, but that presumably include protection against betrayal by clients or participants. If these records could be obtained, they would provide evidence sufficient to prosecute not only the network's members, but also generations of clients who have used its services. The records represent both the network's greatest vulnerability and its most closely guarded secret. The community's relationship with local law enforcement has been cultivated over generations. Several sheriffs and police chiefs in the region have reportedly been on the network's payroll at various times, providing warnings about investigations and ensuring that inquiries are not pursued too aggressively. Federal law enforcement has been more difficult to corrupt, which is why the network has developed sophisticated methods for avoiding federal attention, including the complete absence of interstate communication about operations and the use of cash for all transactions. The FBI agent who dismissed my report may or may not have been compromised, but the outcome would have been the same regardless. The network has been evading federal detection for too long to be vulnerable to a single complainant with no evidence. I want to describe some specific cases that I learned about during my captivity, cases that might provide leads for anyone attempting to investigate the network. I will change certain details to protect sources, but the essential facts are accurate based on what I was told. In 1978, a businessman in Savannah named Robert Carlson disappeared while on a fishing trip in the coastal marshes. His boat was found drifting. His car was found at the marina, but his body was never recovered. The official investigation concluded that he had drowned and been carried out to sea by the currents. What actually happened, according to my captors, was that Carlson had been killed by a brass ankles team hired by his business partner, who was facing exposure for embezzlement that Carlson had discovered. The partner paid approximately $50,000 for the contract and went on to take complete control of the business, which he operated successfully until his own death from natural causes in 2003. His family never knew what he had done, and Carlson's family never knew what had happened to their father and husband. In 1995, a civil rights attorney in Birmingham named Marcus Devane was killed in what appeared to be a random carjacking. His body was found in his vehicle, shot multiple times, his wallet and watch taken to suggest robbery as the motive. The investigation focused on street criminals and never developed any viable suspects. What actually happened, according to my captors, was that Devane had been killed by a brass ankles team, hired by interests who objected to a lawsuit he was pursuing against a major employer in the region. The contract had been expensive because of the profile of the target, reportedly more than $200,000. But the investors considered it worthwhile, given the potential liability they faced in the lawsuit. The case was settled for a fraction of its potential value after Devane's death, with his replacement attorneys unaware that their colleague had been murdered rather than randomly victimized. In 2011, a woman in Charlotte named Teresa Vinson vanished without a trace while driving home from a conference in Atlanta. Her car was found at a rest stop on I-85, with no signs of struggle and no indication of what had happened to her. She was declared legally dead after 7 years, and her estate was distributed according to her will. What actually happened, according to my captors, was that Vinson had been killed by a brass ankles team hired by her husband, who was having an affair and wanted to inherit her substantial assets without the complications of divorce. The husband paid approximately $100,000 for the contract and went on to marry his mistress, using the inheritance to fund a comfortable retirement that continued until his own death from natural causes in 2019. The mistress, now widowed a second time, presumably never knew that her husband had paid to have his first wife murdered. These cases represent a tiny fraction of the network's operations over more than a century. Each one involved a victim whose family never received justice, a perpetrator who never faced consequences, and a community that profited from the transaction. The aggregate of human suffering represented by these cases is beyond calculation. Hundreds or thousands of lives ended prematurely, families destroyed, justice permanently denied. This is what I want anyone who reads this account to understand. The Brass Ankles are not a historical curiosity, a marginalized community that suffered under American racism and deserves sympathy. They are active criminals who have built a profitable enterprise on murder and who continue to operate with impunity. Their victims are real people whose families are still waiting for answers. Their clients are real people who have escaped consequences for the worst crimes imaginable. And their community is a real place where children are being raised right now to continue the work their parents and grandparents have done. I cannot stop this. I tried, and I failed, and I have spent years living with the knowledge of my failure. But I refuse to believe that the network is invincible. Someone somewhere has the resources and the determination to do what I could not. Someone will read this account and recognize the truth in it. Someone will find a way to bring justice to the swamps that have hidden so many crimes for so long. That is my hope. That is all I have left. My name is Jacqueline Monroe. I have told you everything I know. The Forbidden Tribe is waiting. The contracts are still being fulfilled. The bodies are still disappearing into the dark water. Please do not let them wait forever. Please be the one who finally brings the truth to light. Please. There are aspects of my captivity that I have not yet described, experiences that shaped my understanding of the community, and that might provide useful context for anyone who attempts to investigate. During my 5 weeks in the swamps, I was moved between several locations, each one revealing different aspects of how the Brass Ankles lived and how their network operated. The first location where I was held was a cabin that appeared to be primarily residential, home to an extended family that included elderly grandparents, middle-aged parents, and children who ranged from toddlers to teenagers. The family went about its daily routines while I was held in a back room, and I could hear the sounds of normal domestic life through the thin walls, children playing, adults conversing, meals being prepared and consumed. The juxtaposition was surreal, the ordinariness of family life occurring just feet from where I sat, contemplating my possible murder. I came to understand that this was intentional, that showing me the human dimension of the community was part of my education, demonstrating that the people who might kill me were not monsters, but ordinary humans who happened to have chosen a particular occupation. The second location was more institutional, a structure that appeared to have been built specifically for holding people. It had multiple rooms with reinforced doors, a central area where guards could monitor all the doors simultaneously, and a small kitchen where meals were prepared for the detainees. I was not the only person being held there. I saw at least 2 other individuals during my time in that location, a man and a woman who were kept separately and who I was not permitted to speak with. I do not know what their situations were, whether they were fellow investigators who had stumbled onto the truth, or potential witnesses who had seen things they should not have seen, or something else entirely. I do not know whether they survived their captivity, or whether they were among the bodies that disappeared into the swamps while I was eventually released. The third location was the most disturbing, a site that appeared to be used for the actual disposal operations. It was located deep in the swamps, accessible only by boat through channels that were invisible until you were directly upon them. The site included a dock where boats could tie up, a small building that contained equipment and supplies, and a clearing where activities could be conducted away from any possible observation. I was taken there specifically to be shown what happened to bodies, to understand in visceral detail what my fate might be if I made the wrong choices. The demonstration did not involve an actual body, but the equipment and the explanations were explicit enough that my imagination filled in the details with horrifying clarity. I learned during my time in these locations that the community maintained strict protocols for managing threats like me. There was a hierarchy of responses that ranged from simple warnings, delivered through intermediaries who made clear what consequences would follow continued investigation, to the kind of extended captivity I experienced, to the permanent solution of disposal in the swamps. The decision about which response to employ was made collectively by a council of elders who evaluated each threat based on criteria that included the threat's knowledge, their connections, their likely response to lesser measures, and the risks associated with different approaches. My case had apparently been debated extensively before the decision was made to educate and release me, rather than to simply eliminate the threat I posed. The community's internal culture was more complex than I had initially understood. Not all members participated directly in the network's criminal operations. Some families had chosen to remain on the periphery, contributing to the community's legitimate economy and benefiting from the wealth that the network generated without being involved in the actual killing and disposal. These families were aware of what the network did, I learned, but they maintained a distance that allowed them to think of themselves as separate from the violence. This stratification created tensions within the community, with some members of operational families resenting those who benefited without sharing the risks and the moral burden of the work. The children of the community were raised with an understanding of what their families did, introduced gradually to the realities of the network as they matured. The education began with general concepts about loyalty and silence, the importance of protecting the community from outsiders who wished it harm. As children grew older, they were given more specific information about the network's operations, though participation in actual operations was reserved for those who had reached adulthood and who had demonstrated the necessary capabilities. Not all children became operational members. Some chose the peripheral path, contributing to the community in other ways, while others left entirely, moving to cities and building lives that had no connection to the swamps they had grown up in. Those who left were permitted to do so as long as they maintained silence about what they knew, and they were monitored throughout their lives to ensure that they did not become threats. The community's relationship with the broader world was carefully managed to maintain the invisibility that was essential to the network's operations. Members who interacted with outsiders were trained in how to present themselves, what information to share and what to conceal, how to deflect questions that might lead to uncomfortable revelations. The community maintained legitimate businesses that provided cover for the wealth the network generated, including a timber operation, a fishing cooperative, and several small farms that produced goods for local markets. These businesses were genuinely productive, employing community members and generating income that supplemented what the network provided. But they also served as explanations for the community's prosperity that satisfied casual observers, who might otherwise wonder how such isolated people managed to live so comfortably. I was struck during my captivity by the community's sophisticated understanding of law enforcement and its methods. They monitored police communications, maintained informants in local agencies, and had developed detailed protocols for responding to different types of investigations. They knew how evidence was gathered, how cases were built, how prosecutions proceeded, and they had structured their operations to minimize the risks at every stage. The disposal methods were designed to leave no recoverable remains. The payment systems were designed to leave no financial trail. The operational security was designed to ensure that no single failure could compromise the entire network. This was not amateur criminality, but a professional enterprise that had been refined over generations of experience. The question of why the network had never been exposed despite operating for more than a century was one I pondered extensively during my captivity and afterward. The answer, I came to understand, involved multiple factors that reinforced each other to create nearly impenetrable protection. The community's invisibility meant that investigators rarely even knew to look at them. The swamp terrain made evidence recovery virtually impossible. The corruption of local law enforcement ensured that investigations would be derailed before they could develop. The network of intermediaries protected clients from direct connection to the community. The absolute loyalty of community members meant that there were no informants to provide the inside information that usually breaks criminal organizations. and the passage of time meant that evidence and witnesses to older crimes had long since disappeared, making historical cases unprosecutable, even if they could be documented. But I also came to understand that the network's protection was not absolute, that vulnerabilities existed even if they were difficult to exploit. The reliance on intermediaries created potential exposure points where the right pressure might produce cooperation with investigators. The network of clients represented hundreds or thousands of people who knew about the community's services, and whose loyalty depended entirely on self-interest rather than the deeper bonds that tied community members together. The physical evidence in the swamps might be difficult to recover, but was not impossible to find with sufficient resources and determination. And the younger generation of the community, raised in an era of social media and instant communication, might not maintain the perfect discipline that had characterized earlier generations. I share these observations because I believe they point toward strategies that might succeed in exposing the network, even if all previous attempts have failed. The key is not to attack the community directly, but to work around its defenses, exploiting the vulnerabilities that exist at the edges of its protection. Find the intermediaries and pressure them to cooperate. Find the clients whose self-interest might outweigh their fear. Search the swamps with technology that did not exist when the network developed its disposal methods. Monitor the younger generation for signs of the indiscretion that might reveal what their elders have hidden so successfully. I am not optimistic that any of these strategies will be attempted. The network has survived for too long and defeated too many threats for anyone to believe that it can be easily overcome. But I am also not willing to accept that survival equals invincibility, that the past predicts the future, that what has always been protected will always remain protected. History teaches us that every criminal enterprise eventually falls, that secrets eventually emerge, that justice eventually comes even to those who have evaded it for generations. The question is not whether the Brass Ankles network will eventually be exposed, but when and by whom. I would have liked to be the one who brought them down. I had the skills, I thought, the determination and the resources to pursue an investigation to its conclusion. I was wrong. The network was stronger than I understood, my resources were less than I believed, and my determination was not sufficient to overcome the fear that captivity instilled in me. I have lived with that failure for years now, knowing that my silence has allowed the network to continue operating, that bodies have disappeared into the swamps because I could not find the courage to continue what I started. This account is my attempt to break that silence, to provide whatever information I can to whoever might be able to use it. It is not enough, I know. Words on a page cannot bring justice to the victims or punishment to the perpetrators, but it is something, a record that cannot be unsaid, a truth that now exists in the world regardless of what happens to me. My name is Jacqueline Monroe. I tried and I failed, but maybe my failure can become someone else's beginning. Maybe this account will reach the person who can finish what I started. Maybe the Forbidden Tribe will finally face the justice they have escaped for more than a century. That is my hope. That is my prayer. Please do not let me hope in vain. Please,